Welcome to the Sleep Sense Show. As always, brought to you by the Sleep Sense program, where podcast listeners can get a free customized sleep plan by going to www.sleepsense.net/listen.
Hi, I'm Dana. Welcome to the show. If you've listened to any of my podcasts before, you may have heard me lament about my failure as a parent in regards to teaching my first son how to eat properly. If you go back in time and listen to some of my food-related podcasts, you will hear me talk extensively about the challenges I had with my first son. I totally had the sleep thing nailed, but food, on the other hand, was my nightmare. My oldest son was a picky eater right from the start, and we battled together for at least until he was 2.5 before I finally figured out a plan and enlisted some help and really got to the bottom of what our eating issues were. I'm happy to report now that he is an almost 16-year-old who has wonderful eating habits. And so I know it can be done, but I also know how frustrating and challenging it can be when you have a child who's not eating well. So today I want to talk about first foods. How do you introduce a baby to solid foods? When should you do it? And what are the best food options to start with? And just give you a little bit of a food philosophy, if you will, so that you can hopefully avoid a lot of the headache and frustration that I went through with my own son. I definitely learned my lessons well. I had 2 other children after Charlie, and they both became great eaters right out of the gate. So I know it can be done if you get off to a great start. So I hope to share some tips with you today that will help you get off to a fabulous food start with your little one. The most common question I get asked is, when should you start? Now, the recommendations, they sort of fluctuate over the years. I've heard 4 months, I've heard 6 months, and there's been a bit of a flip-flop going on with when exactly is the perfect time to introduce solids. I would say a great rule of thumb is 6 months and up. There really is no reason to start before 6 months. I know a lot of people, I'll tell you, if I had a nickel for every time I heard somebody say that starting solid foods would help a baby sleep better, it's absolutely false. Okay? There is no rush. You do not need to be adding rice cereal to your 3-month-old bottle because you think it's going to help this baby sleep better. You go back and listen to all my sleep podcasts. You will find the answers to your sleep problems, and they have nothing to do with food. That's the good news. It's all about strategy. How you get yourself to sleep every night is what you're looking for when you have a wake up. So if you're dependent on falling asleep with breasts or bottles in your mouth, then that's what you're looking for when you have a wake up, in a nutshell. So if you put that aside and not worry about the sleep thing and just look at the developing baby, we know that 6 months is a great age where they're starting to get curious about food. And you might notice your 6-month-old sitting in a high chair at the table or watching you eat your snack in the living room, and they're very curious. They often will just stare pretty intently at the person who's doing the eating. They're showing curiosity into, hey, what is that thing that you're putting in your mouth? That looks good. So that's really the sort of first signs that you've noticed your baby's curious about food. Another good sign is that they have the ability to grasp things with their fingers or their hands. They can sort of move things up to their mouth. Most babies can grasp that around the 3rd or 4th month, where they're starting to put fingers or fists in their mouth or pick things up off the ground and put them in their mouth. That's obviously a skill you would like a child to have when they begin eating, so that they can start being a bit independent with their food choices. And that's really all you're really watching for, those sort of 2 developmental things to show up for your baby. And obviously, you need to be ready as well. And there's no reason to jump the gun on this before the 6-month age range. However, don't let it linger much past the 6-month mark. After 6 months of life, a baby's there's potential that they're not quite getting enough nutrients from formula or from breast milk, and we should be starting to supplement a little bit with some solid foods. Sometimes, too, if you wait too long, it can, not in every case, but in some cases, it can almost promote pickiness because breastfeeding is faster, drinking from a bottle is faster, it's effective and fast calorie dumps, right? It's a great way to get a lot of calories into your system in a short amount of time. And so some kids, when they get a little older, they'll get a bit picky about that because sitting down in your high chair and like picking up a tiny little bit of food, one little bit at a time, or getting a tiny spoonful of food into your mouth, they lose patience with it and they can get a bit fussy or finicky while they're in their high chair. So I think we've covered that. 6 months is a great time to start getting your child interested and involved in food. Now, I would say the number one thing you need to keep in mind is to not panic around this, right? This is just an introduction to food. This is just, getting them used to food, giving them exposure to different foods. And there's no rush and there's no need for this baby to be eating 3 solid meals a day and 2 snacks. It's just a start. We're just getting his or her little feet wet when it comes to food. So please don't put a lot of pressure on yourself or your child if you don't, every day prepare homemade baby food for 3 times a day. Actually, the recommendation is to just start slowly. Just once a day, for the first week or 2, you're introducing a food to your child. And then as the weeks go on, you're slowly building upon that. Another popular question I get asked is, what should we start with? What first foods are great for a 6-month-old baby? I'm going to recommend that you start with vegetables. That is a great first food. And I would suggest that you start with the bitter vegetables. There's some evidence to suggest that if we introduce babies to the more challenging tastes, right, like broccoli or cauliflower or Brussels sprouts, any of those foods that, they're not an instant hit, right? We kind of have to develop a bit of a taste for it or build up some tolerance to it or however you want to describe it. But they're not, no kid is jumping up and down for broccoli. But these are good first foods because it sets the palate or it gives them, some exposure to those more challenging tastes. Obviously, you want to cook it well enough that it's soft and mushy, that it's not going to be any kind of a choking hazard for your baby. You might even mash it up or puree it in the blender before giving it to them, just to make sure that those first foods are pretty easy to manage. And then just start small. Don't be discouraged if your child makes a disgusted face when you put the food into their mouth or they put the food into their mouth themselves. If you go on YouTube, you'll find oodles of videos of babies making the most hilarious disgusted faces when they're tasting new or different flavors. And that's just human nature. I mean, it doesn't mean that they hate it. It doesn't mean that that's something you can't give them again. It's just a reaction. It's just a face reaction to a new taste in their mouth. And one thing also to keep in mind is that children in general, especially young babies moving into the toddler age range, they need a lot of exposure to something. Just because you tried peas one day and they turned their nose up at it or made a disgusted face or wouldn't even open their mouth for it, does not mean that they hate peas. It just means that they're wary of peas. They're skeptical of peas. And really, when you look at it from a evolutionary perspective, it's good that we were cautious about food. It's good that we didn't just go up to everything we saw on a plant or on the ground and stuff it into our mouths. Some things are not safe to eat. And so that sort of built-in skepticism is just a part of our human nature, and it's just a protective mechanism. So I would say it takes anywhere from 5 to 20 exposures to a food before your baby will even put it in their mouth, really. I've worked with toddlers who we got to show them the squash 20, 25, 30 times before they'll even pick up a little piece of it and put it in their mouth. So this takes repetition. You've got to, keep exposing them, let them see you eating it, have it be on the plate. Don't force the issue though. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I just want to keep seeding it through this. Don't force. That is a very, very fatal mistake that many parents make, myself included. To set this up as some sort of battle of wills is the worst possible start. Just expose them. Maybe you pick up a little piece and put it in your mouth and see if they'll mimic you. And if they don't, leave it alone. Just let it be. And just keep bringing it out and exposing and exposing and exposing. And eventually they will try it at least. And it's fair to assume that children develop certain likes and dislikes around food, but we're not going to really even go there yet. We're not thinking about that at all. We're just building exposure, building in new food items, giving them lots of variety and choice, starting with those vegetables. So once you've got through sort of the bitter, tougher vegetables, then move on to the sort of more favorite vegetables like carrots, for example, potatoes, all of those sort of easier vegetables should come second because now we got the hard stuff out of the way. After you've moved through some vegetables for a couple of weeks, just 1, maybe 2 times a day, just offering up a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons worth of this food exposure to our little ones. Again, not putting any pressure on them to eat more or less, just letting them have what they want. They're usually pretty good at indicating when they're done, right? And that might not mean that their tummy is necessarily full. It just means, you know what? My attention span is over here. I would like to get down or move on to something else now, please. They'll usually turn their face away, or they'll push their spoon away, or they'll start throwing things onto the floor or banging their hands on the tray. And again, I would encourage you to just let it be done. Just wipe them up, clean them up, and move on to something else. Again, you don't want to make this into some sort of battle. You're just going with the flow for now. So after vegetables, move into some grains. There was lots of talk over the years, should we or shouldn't we be introducing grains to babies? Could there be some sort of allergy issues? But again, if we're starting around the 6-month mark, there should be no real problem with moving into some grains. Great ones to start with are oatmeal. Rice is a great place to start. That's sort of the lowest of the potential allergens or allergies that can come from introducing grains. So you could start with some rice, quinoa, pasta. Although I would wait on the pasta. Pasta should be sort of last on your list of grains. Again, that's the easier, more likable grain, right? The more processed of the grains. And so if you start with that, it can be very difficult to get your baby to even try anything beyond that, because it does tend to become a favorite food of such. So let's leave that one. You can definitely mash up some beans or lentils, and that can be part of the first food exposures, getting that kind of all out of the way, and then moving into fruits. Now, the reason why the suggestion is fruits last is because fruits are high in sugar. And we all know that most of us love sugary tasting items. We like that sweet. We sort of end up sort of preferring it and craving it. And so we want to have that be last on the list so babies had a chance to develop their tastes for other flavors as well. But definitely fruits. There's nothing wrong with fruit. They can be a great first food. Bananas are popular. You want to be careful of sort of the harder, crunchier ones like apples, for example. They can be a bit of a choking hazard, so you might want to even bake them or boil them so that or mash them in the blender so that they're a little easier for baby to consume. Now, I often get questions about quantity. And it tends to be that parents don't think their children are eating enough. And I can tell you, and again, having been there, people, I know this feeling. It feels like they're eating very, very little and you think they're starving. I assure you they are not. Okay? Our expectations of how much a child should be eating are usually way out of whack with how much they need. And the good news about babies is they know how much they need. Their body just knows, right? There's no baggage around food yet. They're not eating because they're sad or depressed. They're not having treats because they're rewarding themselves. There's none of that stuff going on yet, and hopefully never if we can avoid it. But they don't have that same sort of stuff. So they are very, very, very good at regulating their calorie needs. And if you start pushing and pressuring and trying to stuff more into this child, that's where problems start. Okay? What we're trying to do is teach children to regulate their own body needs, right? How much does it take to feel comfortable? How much does it take to feel uncomfortable and full? What does hunger feel like? What does full feel like? These are all things we want them to start experiencing, so when they're old enough, they can regulate this themselves and know, you know what, I'm hungry, or no, I'm actually fine, I feel full. And the difference between feeling satisfied and feeling stuffed is also a very important distinction that people need to make, that children need to grow into. And again, just look around you, look in, the adult population. There are so many adults who have no idea what the difference is between feeling satisfied and feeling stuffed. And most people will eat until they feel stuffed and uncomfortable, and then moan and groan about it for the next hour or two while it digests. And what we want to teach is just to stop when you feel satisfied and still comfortable. And that's huge. So we definitely want them to be able to figure that out. So that's why right out of the gate, we are being extremely mindful about the messages that we're sending. And don't get yourself wrapped up into this. This is not about you, right? This is about your child learning and developing healthy, wonderful eating habits for life. Okay, so this is not 5 more bites so that you feel good, right? This has nothing to do with you. It's all about your child. So just gently and no pressure, and just moving through and giving them a chance to sort of figure all this out in their own time. And try not to compare your baby to other babies. I can remember part of my sort of mental snag around my son's food is that I babysat a little boy the same age as my son, and he just mowed on anything I put in front of him. He would just 2 fists up into the mouth. He just loved food. He just ate so much food. He was also twice the size of my son. So I should have kept that into some level of perspective, but I didn't. And I was just constantly comparing what they were eating and feeling stressed and anxious constantly that my son just wasn't eating enough. So please try not to make that same mistake, and just keep your eye on your own child and know that they're okay, that things are progressing, they're eating as much as they want and need, and you need to just chill out, really, is my best advice around it. Now, I would also suggest that you allow your child to do as much of this as possible. It's called child-led weaning, and it's just basically allowing your child to finger food, get his hands on food and into his mouth on his own. So you don't have to sit there and shovel food into their mouth with a spoon. That's a great way to start, obviously, so the child gets a sense of, oh, this is what we do. We put stuff in our mouth, we chew it, we swallow it. That's how it all works. But as quickly as you can, move away from that and just start putting things out on the tray that are manageable, obviously, keeping an eye on it being soft enough and easy enough for a child to gum and then get down their throat and pick up with their own hands. And that there's kind of two things that are great about that. It takes the workload off of your shoulders in a lot of ways. You can just put the food out and then let your child explore with that. And it also, there is some evidence to suggest that this helps the child develop really good food relationships so that they understand they have control over this, that this is directed by them, that they can eat what they want, they can choose what they want, they can stop when they want. And again, this is all setting them up for really good habits around food. Obviously, you're making the choices of what to put on the tray, right? We're not letting our 9-month-old just fill his tray with cookies. You're making the choices, but then we're allowing them the right to eat what they choose to eat and how much of it they choose to eat. And if you see that they've eaten all of the carrots and you've got a few more in the pan, just go ahead and put those on the plate. And that day they might eat all the carrots and the next day they might eat all the peas, and that's okay. When you're looking at how children eat, you will most likely see that some days they eat a lot, some days they eat very little, some days they only eat one thing, other days they eat everything. And again, you just need to take it all in and ease up on your concerns or your pressures and look more at a week. In the course of a week, what has your child consumed? How much have they consumed? And you'll see that it really does balance out quite well. It's very common for young children to eat pretty significantly at breakfast time, eat a little bit less at lunch, and sometimes not eat much of their dinner at all. And again, that can lead to panic, but I want to encourage you to let that one go too, that this is common and it's nothing that you need to start worrying about or putting pressure on your child about. One last little bit of advice before I set you free here today. When you get started with this, keep an eye on liquid consumption. Now, we're talking about babies here, sort of the 6 to 12-month age range. Obviously, breast milk or formula is the primary calorie source. Food is just a supplement, a complement, an exposure, just getting them into the idea of food, and it's just this slow sort of gradual process. And that's perfect. That's exactly what you want to do. After the 12-month mark, though, now food becomes the main calorie source, and milk in any form is the beverage or the accompaniment. And that can be a really hard shift for many a parent, because for those first 12 months it's been all liquid, and now we're switching to all solids and liquid being a beverage. So if you're finding that your 12, 13, 15-month-old is being a bit picky about food or not really eating as much as you think that they should, again, keeping an eye on that, your expectations, but then have a look at liquid consumption, because a common problem is that a toddler is relying heavily still on milk-based calories, whether that's coming from cow milk or formula or breast milk. That can be the main culprit for why a toddler is not eating as many solids as they should be, is because they're filling up, 800 calories worth of milk in a day, then they really don't need to eat that much more to make up their quota. So have a good hard look at that if you find that that's a bit of an issue for you. But I just want to leave you with just this little nugget of wisdom that this is about creating a healthy relationship with food for your child, that hopefully they can avoid a lot of the things and struggles and baggage that adults end up developing by just letting them have ownership over this, giving them healthy choices, and then letting them decide what they're going to eat, how much they're going to eat, and letting them stop when they want to without putting on a ton of pressure. So a good way to break it up is your job as the parent is to decide when they will eat and what they will eat. When and what, right? Keep in mind that little tummies need frequent fueling, so every 2 hours is a good rule of thumb to offer some sort of snack or food source. So you decide what and when. Your child's job, their responsibility, is to decide how much or not at all, right? They might sit down at lunch and not decide to eat anything, and you've got to let that go. And know that in 2 hours I will offer some more food choices, and they will most likely have some because now they will be very hungry. And know that this is just as part of the learning process. If I don't eat now, then, oh, that's right, I get hungry later. Again, we don't know this when we first enter this world. We don't understand these things yet. And so the more times where they're sort of faced with some hunger pains because they chose not to eat, the better and faster they will learn it for themselves and then start making better choices. Thanks so much for listening today. As always, please sleep well.
Thanks so much for listening. For more great tips on helping your child sleep through the night, remember to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher, and never miss an episode.